I'm Galila Asris, and welcome to the Anatomically Correct World of Anatomy, Part 2. If you've already watched the Anatomically Correct World of Anatomy, Part 1, you probably remember a lot about the muscular system, the skeletal system, and the nervous system. Hopefully, you remember terms like the vertebral column or backbone, and terms like the cranium and skull. If you need to learn about any of these things, this is not your videotape, because we'll be using a lot of these terms. Don't worry, you're not going to fail your anatomy test.
Just go directly to your school bookstore and buy Part 1. But then again, maybe you fancy the circulatory system, or perhaps the respiratory system, or if you're really wild, the digestive system. If so, you have the right videotape and are in for a rare treat.
Anatomy is fun.
With enthusiastic recommendations like that one, how can you do anything but jump on board?
What I'm holding in my left hand are the insert cards included with this video. They contain important diagrams and information you'll need to keep up with us. What I'm holding in my right hand is a small voodoo doll used by the flesh-eating Huron tribesmen. You'll need the cards. The doll is optional. Are the insert cards included with this video? They contain important diagrams.
Where did you get this?
You'll need to keep up with.
Who taught you how to do this? You don't read? You don't go to class? All you do is sit and watch these videotapes all day long. Who taught you how to do this?
You, Dad! I learned it from watching you.
Parents who slack off have children who slack off.
No matter what anyone tells you, this tape is not a substitute for reading your textbook, listening to your professor, or going to class.
But what if I want to grow up to be a professional gambler or a hired goon?
Well, maybe in that case. But also remember that this is video. So if you fall behind or become confused, you can rewind or pause the tape. Or become confused, you can rewind or pause. You can rewind or pause the tape. Stop it. Please. Please stop. Stop. Please.
You get the picture. This tape can help you learn about anatomy at your own pace. So sit back, relax, put on a comfortable pair of pants, and grab your voodoo doll. It's time to learn some anatomy.
Part 1, the circulatory system.
The circulatory system is responsible for more jobs than you know, and it does them by using only two hardworking divisions, the cardiovascular system and the lymphatic system. The first system we'll talk about is the cardiovascular system.
Section A, the cardiovascular system.
The cardiovascular system delivers oxygen and nutrients to cells and removes carbon dioxide and metabolic wastes from cells. The cardiovascular system is made up of the heart and blood vessels.
The heart acts like a pump, pumping blood through the blood vessels. Blood vessels are like the plumbing that carries the blood freely through the body.
Hi, I'm a blood collector. My name is Chuck. A lot of people try to describe serial killers as bloodthirsty. This is simply not true. Well, take me for instance. I have no desire whatsoever to drink blood. I just collect it and store it in my refrigerator to be used at a later date as engine fuel.
When you take blood and you break it down, it's made up of two components. They are the plasma and the formed elements.
The difference between the plasma and formed elements is that the formed elements are cells and cell bits. Well, plasma is mostly water with dissolved stuff like proteins in it. So the formed elements are living blood cells, full of life and born to party. They're the erythrocytes, or red blood cells, and the leukocytes, or white blood cells. There's also the thrombocytes, or the platelets.
Erythrocytes carry oxygen, the leukocytes fight infection, and the platelets, which are actually cell fragments, these little buggers help with blood clotting. That means they help you stop bleeding when you're cut. All these formed elements are suspended in the plasma. Plasma is a non-cellular, straw-colored, sticky fluid that's 90% water.
Now you have to understand that blood does a lot of things. These things will be covered in greater detail if you take physiology. For now, just remember that blood is all about exchange. Exchange, exchange, exchange.
Blood's in charge of exchanging gases, hormones, nutrients, and waste between tissues. So blood is like a liquid cargo ship, carrying stuff to and taking stuff from tissues. Exciting, huh? Another thing that blood does is regulate body temperature. It does this by absorbing and distributing heat. But that's not all. The blood prevents infection with its white blood cells. And on top of all that, the blood also maintains proper fluid volume in the body.
Wow, the proper fluid volume. You don't know how important that is. Without blood, we'd be a dried up husk like the guy in my basement. And just think, we have so much blood. The normal amount of blood in the human body is 5.5 liters. That's 8% of our body weight. That's 5 times more than an average serving of cola.
If you think blood is exciting, wait till you get the skinny on the human heart. Now, most people don't have much exposure to the heart outside of that scary scene from the Indiana Jones movies.
Kalima! Kalima!
But there's so much more to the human heart. The heart is a muscular organ that pumps blood throughout the body. Everyone knows that. But did you know that the heart weighs about a pound? That's pretty heavy, and if you don't believe me, carry a human heart in your backpack for a day and see if you don't need a nap.
The heart is located inside of the medial region of the thoracic cavity called the mediastinum. That's a hollow space in what you probably know as your chest. It is anterior to, or in front of, the vertebral column, or backbone. The heart is also posterior to, or behind, the sternum. The heart is laterally surrounded by the lungs. That means there's a lung on each side, and most of the heart is located just below and to the left of the center of the sternum, or the midsternal line.
What we call the base of the heart is actually the top, but it's called the base because it's the wider, flatter region. So, remember, when you're talking about the base of the heart, you're talking about the top. The great vessels, which we'll talk about later, branch directly out of the top of the heart. The bean-shaped portion of the heart in its lower left corner is called the apex of the heart. The apex rests on the diaphragm, a muscular structure we'll give you the details on later. The place where the apex of the heart contacts the chest wall is called the point of maximal intensity, which sounds like a bad summer blockbuster.
One heart. One dream. No one will stop me. 8 million bullets. Point of maximum intensity. If it costs this much to make, it's bound to be good. Coming this summer to a theater near you.
The point of maximal intensity, or PMI, is the part of your chest where you can directly feel your heartbeat. Try it. The PMI is between your 5th and 6th ribs, just below your left nipple. My heart is beating to the tune of La Bamba.
The heart itself is covered by a double-layered sac called the pericardium. The word pericardium means around the heart. Pretty clever, huh? The 2 layers of the pericardium are the fibrous and serosal layers.
The fibrous layer anchors the heart and bravely wards off infection.
The serosal layer is subdivided into the parietal and visceral pericardium. The parietal pericardium is the outer layer of the serosal pericardium. The inner layer is the visceral pericardium. Both of these layers help out the heart by reducing friction as the heart moves. They do this by secreting a gooey, lubricating fluid known as the pericardial fluid.
The actual heart wall is also multi-layered. There are 3 layers. These layers are known as the epicardium, the myocardium, and the endocardium.
The epicardium is the outermost layer of the heart wall. In fact, it's actually the same thing as the visceral pericardium. But don't tell the epicardium that. It might get angry. Just remember, epi means upon, and upon should make you think outer.
The myocardium is the thick middle layer of the heart and is made up of cardiac muscle tissue. This layer is full of blood vessels, lymph vessels, and excitement. It's the part of the heart wall that actually contracts. The myocardium makes up the bulk of the heart wall, and its cells are stacked together in neat spiral formations that make it stronger for maximum pumping power, power. Now, myo actually means muscle, so whenever you hear the word myo, think of muscle, or, if you prefer, think of middle.
And finally, the endocardium is the innermost layer of the heart wall. That's not so hard to remember because endo sounds like inner. The endocardium is a thin white lining. It is continuous with the blood vessels. This means that the endocardium melds right into the blood vessels that enter and leave the heart. So if it helps you out, endo equals inner.
Sure, the epicardium, myocardium, and endocardium are exciting, but not half as exciting as the story of the 4 heart chambers and 4 associated valves.
The heart is broken up into 4 chambers with 4 valves. These chambers and valves discharge, direct, and receive blood.
The chambers are divided into superior chambers, which are pretty much the top level of the heart, and the inferior chambers, which are like the basement of the heart. The superior chambers are called atria. You have both a left atrium and a right atrium. Both of these chambers receive blood, so they're called the receiving chambers of the heart. So remember, the superior atria receive blood.
The right atrium receives oxygen-poor blood from 3 blood vessels: the superior vena cava, the inferior vena cava, and the coronary sinus. The superior vena cava drains blood from your head and upper body, basically all regions above your diaphragm. The inferior vena cava drains blood from the abdomen and lower body, basically all the areas below your diaphragm. The coronary sinus drains the myocardium, which, if you're on top of things, you remember as the middle, muscular layer of the heart wall.
Meanwhile, the left atrium receives oxygen-rich blood from the lungs by way of the 2 left and 2 right pulmonary veins. It might be helpful to remember that whenever you hear the word pulmonary, you're talking about the lungs. In any event, cement it in your head. Atria receive blood. The left atrium receives oxygen-rich blood. That's blood full of oxygen.
Let's discuss the other 2 heart chambers.
The 2 inferior or bottom chambers of the heart are called ventricles. You can think of them as the basement of the heart. It's the ventricle's job to pump blood out of the heart. It might help to remember that the ventricles are like vents because they let blood out of the heart. The walls of the ventricles are thicker and contract more forcefully than the walls of the atria because of their pump-intensive job. So the atria never pump blood out of the heart. The lazy good-for-nothings just receive it. But the ventricles work hard to pump blood. In fact, the wall of the left ventricle is the thickest wall in the heart because it has to pump the hardest. That's because the left ventricle has to pump the blood into an artery called the aorta, which we'll get to later. This pump begins to propel the blood to the entire rest of the body. This unbelievable pumping power gives the ventricles their nickname, the discharging chambers.
So the right ventricle receives oxygen-poor blood from the right atrium. Then the right ventricle pumps the oxygen-poor blood into the lungs through a large artery called the pulmonary trunk. The pulmonary trunk branches off into the right and left pulmonary arteries. The right pulmonary artery leads to the right lung, and the left pulmonary artery to the left lung. Left to left, right to right. Easy, huh?
When the blood hits the lungs, look out, baby. It's oxygenation time. The lungs fill the blood up with oxygen in exchange for carbon dioxide. Then, the oxygen-rich blood is returned to the heart by way of the pulmonary veins. The pulmonary veins deliver oxygen-rich blood to the left atrium. After that, the left ventricle receives oxygen-rich blood from the left atrium. Then, the left ventricle pumps the oxygen-rich blood into the mighty, mighty aorta. The aorta, as we mentioned before, is a huge blood vessel that carries blood to the rest of the body.
If you're confused about what blood vessels are, don't worry. We'll describe them in detail in just a few moments.
For now, just remember that the term vein describes a blood vessel that takes blood towards the heart, and an artery is one that takes blood away. 2 popular veins to remember are the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava, which drain oxygen-poor blood into the right atrium of the heart. A popular artery to remember is the aorta, which takes oxygen-rich blood from the left ventricle and delivers it to the rest of the body.
We'll give you the details on the arteries and veins in a little bit. For now, let's review the path of blood in the heart.
The veins superior vena cava and inferior vena cava and coronary sinus drain oxygen-poor blood into the right atrium. The blood exits the right atrium and enters the right ventricle. Then the right ventricle pumps the blood into the pulmonary trunk. The pulmonary trunk branches off into the left and right pulmonary arteries. The pulmonary arteries take the blood into the lungs. The lungs fill the blood with oxygen and relieve it of carbon dioxide. Then they deposit the oxygen-rich blood into the pulmonary veins. The pulmonary veins carry the blood to the left atrium. The left atrium delivers blood to the left ventricle. The left ventricle pumps blood into the aorta. Then the aorta carries blood to a system of blood vessels throughout the entire body. Then the process repeats again and again until the end of time, or the end of you, whichever comes first. Well, that's pretty much it for the heart chambers. Now let's talk about the valves.
Basically, heart valves are like hatches or trapdoors within the heart chambers. It's their job to make sure blood flows one way.
The valves do this by closing to prevent backflow. So when the blood flows from one chamber to another, valves open up and then close behind the blood so the blood doesn't flow back into the area it just left.
The heart has 4 valves, 2 atrioventricular or AV valves, and 2 semilunar or SL valves.
The 2 AV valves are located in between the atrial and ventricular chambers. They are the tricuspid AV valve and the bicuspid or mitral AV valve. Like we said, these valves help prevent backflow of blood into the atria.
The tricuspid valve is like a door made up of 3 flexible flaps. That's where the prefix tri comes from. The tricuspid valve prevents backflow from the right ventricle into the right atrium. So after blood flows from the right atrium into the right ventricle, it's the tricuspid valve that keeps it from backtracking.
The bicuspid valve is like a door made up of 2 flexible flaps. This valve prevents backflow from the left ventricle into the left atrium. So when blood enters the left ventricle, the bicuspid valve prevents it from accidentally backing up into the left atrium. The 2 other important heart valves are the 2 semilunar valves. These valves are made up of 3 flaps. They're called semilunar valves because they kind of look like half moons. They are the pulmonary semilunar valve and the aortic semilunar valve.
These valves are located at the bases of the large arteries coming out of the ventricles. The pulmonary semilunar valve prevents backflow of blood from the pulmonary trunk into the right ventricle. The aortic semilunar valve prevents backflow of blood from the aorta into the left ventricle.
And that's it.
You can still tell me more about valves if you want.
No, that's it. We're done with chambers and valves.
Heart disorders.
Heart disorders, yeah, you heard me. Heart disorders. Now, there are a whole bunch of things that can go wrong with your heart. These things can cause discomfort or even death. So listen up. It just might save your life.
Alex, please!
What?
Remember the myocardium? That's the middle layer of the heart. Now, if you remember the myocardium, you probably recall that the myocardium is really thick. In fact, it's so thick that blood has a hard time traveling through it to nourish the heart tissue itself.
So the heart has its own circulatory system. This involves blood vessels that bring blood to and drain blood from the heart tissue itself. So coronary arteries bring blood to the tissue of the heart, and coronary veins drain blood from that tissue. They provide the functional blood supply for the heart. But unfortunately, most diseases related to the heart impact this coronary circulatory system.
An example of a disease that affects the circulatory system inside the heart is angina pectoris. Angina pectoris is often called choked chest, which suggests that it's not very pleasant. Choked chest can result from spasms that block the coronary arteries and cut off blood supply to the myocardium. This causes intense chest pain and pressure.
Another example of a serious heart disorder that affects the coronary circulatory system is the myocardial infarction. Myocardial infarction is just a fancy word for heart attack.
Myocardial infarction, or heart attack, is caused by the death of cardiac muscle cells. This is usually the result of prolonged blockage in the vessels of the coronary circulatory system. This leads to inadequate blood flow and oxygen delivery to cardiac muscles. Eventually, if the cardiac muscles are deprived of oxygen for long enough, the cardiac muscle tissue is damaged. This damaged muscle is replaced with scar tissue that impedes the pumping of blood.
There are certain conditions that deal with blood being pumped in and out of the heart that are a little less serious, but still nothing to scoff at. These conditions are known as tachycardia and bradycardia.
See, if you're at rest and not shooting bottle rockets off a bridge and running from the law, your heart beats about 75 times a minute. This average is called the heart rate. People with tachycardia or bradycardia have abnormal heart rates.
People with tachycardia suffer from heart rates that are far above normal. usually greater than 100 beats a minute. If tachycardia persists for a long period of time, the heart will beat erratically and eventually stop functioning. On the other side of the coin, people with bradycardia have heart rates that are abnormally slow, usually under 60 beats a minute.
But don't get paranoid about the beating of your heart and think you have tachycardia if your heart's beating fast. You see, during exercise, the heart rate always increases to give the body, especially the skeletal muscles, more oxygen. So the faster you walk, jump, wrestle, or run, the faster your heart's going to beat.
Now that we've covered some abnormal heart behavior, let's talk a little bit more about the normal workings of the heart. The heart, when it's healthy, produces discrete sounds.
My heart makes a yodeling sound.
No, that's the two Swiss girls in your stomach.
The sounds the heart makes are commonly referred to as lub and dub, which, contrary to popular belief, is not the name of a popular 1920s vaudeville duo.
Hey there, Dub. Why are you throwing that clock up and down?
Hey, because I want to see time fly.
Well, put it down. You broke it.
That's okay, Lub. It's your clock. Good night, folks.
The sounds lub and dub really are technical terms, and they can be used to help us determine different heart functions. You see, the sounds have to do with valves. You remember valves. They're the little doors that prevent the backflow of blood.
The first sound, lub, is the sound of the AV valves closing after blood has moved from the right atrium to the right ventricle and the left atrium to the left ventricle. The term dub describes the second sound. This is the sound of the semilunar valves closing.
If you've ever heard anyone use the phrase heart murmur, they're usually describing an abnormal whooshing sound that occurs when heart valves aren't functioning properly. So remember, lub-dub, good, whoosh, bad. Yodeling, not possible.
When the heart goes about its business, lubbing and dubbing all day long, it pumps out a certain volume of blood, which is measured in milliliters.
The volume of blood that the heart pumps out per beat is called the stroke volume. A healthy adult heart will have a stroke volume of 70 milliliters per beat. The total volume of blood expelled over 1 minute is called the cardiac output. To find the cardiac output, multiply the heart rate by the stroke volume. So let's find the cardiac output for a healthy human being. Like we said, average stroke volume is 70 milliliters per beat, and the average heart beats 75 times per minute. So multiply those two together to find the cardiac output. That's 70 milliliters times 75 beats per minute. So, the average cardiac output for a healthy human is 5,250 milliliters per minute.
That's the average. Of course, during exercise or intense moments like saving lives, cardiac output will increase so that the body gets more oxygen.
Blood vessels.
We've said it once before and we'll say it again. Blood vessels make up the other major part of the cardiovascular system. There are 3 major vessel types in the body, and these babies have quite a job. All the blood that flows to and from the heart flows through these bad boys. Because they all have different jobs, vessel types differ in length, diameter, and thickness. The 3 different types of blood vessels are arteries, capillaries, and veins.
The walls of all 3 types of blood vessels contain structures that are common to all 3. For instance, the blood vessel walls of most arteries and veins are made up of 3 layers called tunics. The tunics surround a cavity inside the blood vessel called the lumen. The 3 tunics that surround the lumen, or opening, are called the tunica intima, the tunica media, and the tunica adventitia.
The tunica intima is the thin innermost layer of the vessel wall. Basically, the tunica intima is just a continuation of the endocardium of the heart wall that extends into all the blood vessels of the body. The cells of this layer are close-fitting and create a slick surface that help reduce friction as blood flows freely and happily through the lumen.
It's easy to remember that the tunica intima is the innermost layer because the prefix in can help you remember inner.
The tunica media is the middle layer of circularly arranged smooth muscle cells and elastic fibers. The tunica media is responsible for the changes in the diameter of the lumen, so the tunica media is pretty much in the driver's seat when it comes to changes in lumen diameter, blood flow, and blood pressure.
The muscle walls of the tunica media can contract and relax. This contraction and relaxation changes the diameter of the lumen. With contraction of the tunica media, the lumen decreases. This is called vasoconstriction. When the tunica media relaxes, the diameter of the lumen increases. This is called vasodilation.
You shouldn't have any problem remembering that the tunica media is the middle layer, because media sounds like medium, which kinda means middle.
The tunica adventitia sounds like the most adventurous of the tunics, as if it were responsible for fighting off villains and killing wolves. But alas, it's just the outermost layer of the vessel wall.
The tunica adventitia is covered with nerve fibers. It also may be surrounded by tiny blood vessels called the vasa vasorum. Vasa vasorum carry blood to the tissues which nourish the tissue of the vessel walls. Now tell me that doesn't drip adventure.
So each of the three vessel types, arteries, capillaries, and veins, have similar characteristics. Each of the vessels contain one, if not all, of the three tunica layers. But just like people, dogs, and socket wrenches, these vessel types differ in length, diameter, and thickness. But don't just take my word for it. Why not learn more about vessels from the well-known assassins of our nation's history? Here to tell you more is a poorly animated version of John Wilkes Booth.
As a well-known assassin from our nation's history, I know a lot about the needless spilling of blood. And so, I give thee one of the more lovable and well-known blood carriers, the artery.
The arteries are vessels that transport blood away from the heart. The word artery also starts with the letter A, just like the word away. Typically, arteries have a really large tunica media, which helps the artery control the distribution of blood throughout the body by helping them constrict and expand with the pumping of blood.
A prime example of an artery is the aorta, the huge vessel that takes oxygen-rich blood from the left ventricle and transports it to the rest of the body.
I am Charles Guiteau. Down with Garfield. Long live the capillary.
That was twisted assassin Charles Guiteau with a cryptic introduction to the capillary.
Capillaries form dense networks found in almost all tissues of the human body. These networks are called capillary beds, and boy are they tiny. The diameter of a capillary is only 8/1000ths of a millimeter, just large enough to let red blood cells pass through single file. Capillaries, unlike arteries and veins, only have a tunica intima. This allows for an easy exchange of gas with bodily tissues. This makes the capillaries pretty handy.
Hello, how are you being? I am Zolgos. I am obscure. And now, the veins.
For those of you who had no idea who that was, which is probably everyone watching, it was obscure assassin and funny man Leon Zolgos. And that was a little introduction to veins, another type of blood vessel. Veins have an important job too. They transport blood towards the heart.
Veins have thinner walls and larger lumens than arteries, but that's okay because not as much pressure is exerted on the walls of veins as on the arterial walls. In any event, veins are pretty important. 65% of total blood volume is in the veins every minute of your life. Otherwise, you're dead.
Veins below the diaphragm, that is, veins in the lower half of the body, are equipped with valves. These valves are similar to those found in the heart. Basically, their job is to make sure blood stays on track, happily flowing in one direction towards the heart. This is important in the veins of the lower body because the blood must flow against the force of gravity, so valves keep blood in line and on track.
We're done with blood vessels. Arteries, veins, and capillaries are all there are, so we need no more introductions or assassins. But what we do need to talk about is blood pressure.
You see, blood pressure is the force exerted on a vessel by the blood inside of it. Differences in pressure within the blood vessels are what drive the blood throughout the body.
When we measure blood pressure, we express it in terms of millimeters of mercury. You know, the poison stuff that's inside thermometers.
120 mmHg is the average blood pressure in healthy humans. So if someone has a blood pressure of 120 mmHg, the mm stands for millimeters, and the Hg is the symbol for mercury. So, a blood pressure of 120 mmHg is equal to the pressure exerted by a column of mercury 120 millimeters high. The pressure on the vessel walls is equal to the pressure exerted by that amount of mercury. This may seem strange, measuring blood pressure in terms of a deadly substance, but that's how the doctors do it, so it must be right.
Also related to pressure is the arterial pulse.
You can feel your arterial pulse when you touch your lower arm proximal to or above your palm, in the carotid artery on your neck, and a number of other places on the body.
The arterial pulse is created by surges of pressure in the arteries created by the heartbeat. The heartbeat tells us the heart rate. Blood pressure can be measured by using an instrument called a sphygmomanometer, or blood pressure cuff. I actually call it the arm strangler of doom.
And then, of course, there's the sounds of Korotkov. You can't discuss blood pressure without mentioning the beautiful, beautiful sounds of Korotkov.
My chest is alive with the sound of Korotkov.
Ah, the sounds of Korotkov. These are the sounds that blood makes as it flows through a constricted artery, an artery whose tunica media has contracted and decreased the size of its lumen. These two sounds reflect two types of blood pressure that can be measured. We hear these sounds by using a sphygmomanometer.
Now, before we discuss the sounds of Korotkov, it's important for you to remember what happens in the heart. Ventricles are contracting, pumping blood into arteries and putting pressure on them. When the ventricles contract, this is called ventricular systole. This creates the systolic blood pressure. Now, just after the ventricles contract, when they're relaxed, this is called ventricular diastole. This creates diastolic blood pressure.
When we first hear the sounds of Korotkov, the ventricles are contracting and the left ventricle is creating a lot of pressure in the aorta. This is called systolic pressure. Systolic pressure is normally measured at around 120 millimeters mercury. When the sounds of Korotkov disappear, there's less pressure in the aorta because the left ventricle is relaxing. This is known as diastolic pressure. Diastolic pressure is normally measured at around 80 millimeters mercury.
Unfortunately, there are a number of conditions that go hand in hand with blood pressure. Things like hypertension.
Hypertension is another name for sustained high blood pressure. People with hypertension have a systolic pressure higher than 140 millimeters of mercury and a diastolic pressure above 90 millimeters mercury. This increase in pressure can be caused by a number of factors, but the end result is always the same, an increase in resistance to blood flow in vessels. When the pressure gets higher, it's harder for blood to flow. It's like trying to channel a fire hose into a garden hose.
The scary thing about hypertension is that most of the time it's asymptomatic, meaning it doesn't give any symptoms. That's how it earned its nickname, the silent killer. It's hard to know you have it, but it can result in heart failure, kidney failure, or stroke. There are two common forms of hypertension, primary hypertension and secondary hypertension. Primary or essential hypertension is responsible for about 90% of hypertensive cases. It's somewhat of a mystery in that no one knows what really causes it. There are some who believe that high salt, obesity, stress, smoking, heredity, and old age contribute to primary hypertension, but no one can be sure. It's like the Bermuda Triangle of the cardiovascular system. But fear not. Primary hypertension can be controlled by drug therapy and dietary restrictions.
Less common than primary hypertension is secondary hypertension. This accounts for about 10% of all hypertensive cases. There's no shroud of mystery surrounding secondary hypertension. We know it's caused by things like kidney malfunction, arteriosclerosis or clogged arteries, and endocrine disorders. If you're confused, don't worry. We'll be talking about the endocrine system later on, and you'll understand the word endocrine. Then you can rewind to this section and say, oh! But for now, just smile and be content that you know the cause of secondary hypertension. I'm Slim Goodbody.
I'm Slim Goodbody.
Good body.
Them good body.
Did you know the ancient Mayans used blood vessels to make beaded necklaces? Probably not, because they didn't.
That's about it for the cardiovascular system. The heart and the blood vessels will always serve you, proud and true. But there is one more important section in the circulatory system, namely the lymphatic system.
Section B, the lymphatic system.
The lymphatic system is the other major division of the circulatory system. It's a hodgepodge of all kinds of interesting stuff. Things like lymph vessels, lymph nodes, tissues, and organs.
Now, you may not think the lymphatic system is important. I mean, hey, who wants to hear about the lymphatic system when the always likable and ever popular cardiovascular system is hogging the limelight? But the truth is, without the lymphatic system, the cardiovascular system wouldn't even work, and our immune system would be utterly useless. That's because the lymphatic system restores vital fluid to the blood and plays a key role in the resistance to disease. So, I don't care if you're really big cardiovascular fans. You give the lymphatic system the respect it deserves, and you listen up real good.
Lymph circulates in the lymphatic system, just like blood circulates in the cardiovascular system. That's why the two systems together are called the circulatory system.
While the blood has a system of vessels that circulates blood throughout the body, lymph has a system of vessels that circulates lymph.
Lymph is a fluid that comes from interstitial fluid. Interstitial fluid surrounds the cells that make up the tissue of the organs in your body. Lymph contains protein and other goodies that have been lost from the blood. These substances need to get back to the blood, so lymph is transported through the lymph vessels back to the bloodstream.
These vessels are located throughout the body, but the main lymph drainage vessels are the right lymphatic duct and the left lymphatic or thoracic duct. The right lymphatic duct drains lymph from the right upper arm, the right side of the head, and the thorax. The thoracic duct drains lymph from the rest of the body. Both of these vessels drain into veins near the heart.
Lymph vessels are so similar to blood vessels that they even have some of the same structures as veins.
They have the same three tunics as blood vessels, the intima, media, and adventitia. Also, like veins, lymph vessels only flow towards the heart and are equipped with valves. The differences between the two vessels are that lymph vessels have even thinner walls and have a lot more branches than cardiovascular vessels. Lymph transport is also much slower than the transport of blood through veins.
And now, lymphoid organs.
When you're talking about the lymphatic system, you can't leave out the lymphoid organs. Well, I suppose you could, but it would be unjust, and I won't be a part of it. You see, the lymphoid organs include a whole bunch of structures, things like lymph nodes, the spleen, the thymus gland, and even mucosa-associated lymphatic tissues. I know, that's a mouthful. So you can call mucosa-associated lymphatic tissues by the acronym MALT for short. Now, MALTs play an extremely important role in bodily defense and resistance to infection.
Some organs that fall in the MALT category are the tonsils, the appendix, and the small things in the small intestines called Peyer's patches. All these structures help remove bacteria from the body, and we'll get to them soon enough. But first things first, the lymph nodes.
Lymph nodes are small kidney-shaped structures less than 1 inch in diameter. They're full of white blood cells. These white blood cells are responsible for destroying bacteria, cancer cells, and foreign particles.
There are hundreds of lymph nodes in the body, clustered along the lymph vessels. They vary in size and shape, but most of them are bean-shaped and less than 1 inch in length.
Yeah? Well, then how come I haven't seen them?
Oh, don't worry. They're there. Most lymph nodes are just obscured by surrounding tissue, but that doesn't mean that they aren't there, proud and true, beneath your skin. But the lymph nodes aren't alone. There are other structures, lurking, waiting, like the spleen.
The spleen is the largest lymphoid organ. People often use the spleen as a comedy buzzword because they think it sounds funny when they say it.
Hey, Paul, you touch me, I tear out your spleen!
The spleen is actually a red-colored organ the size of your fist.
It's posterior or in back of the stomach and in the upper left side of the abdominal cavity.
In some senses, the spleen is like Fred Sanford. It's in the business of waste and storage. The spleen removes old, defective red blood cells and stores iron extracted from red blood cells for future use. But in many ways, the spleen is nothing like Fred Sanford. First off, the spleen isn't related to Lamont, and secondly, it produces red blood cells in the embryos of pregnant mothers. It even acts as a blood reservoir. I'd like to see Fred Sanford do that.
Another organ in the lymphatic system is the thymus gland.
The thymus gland is located behind your sternum in your upper thorax. Basically, it produces hormones. These hormones help white blood cells called T cells mature. T cells are involved in our immune system. The thymus gland is most active in infants, but it regresses and becomes less active with age.
Now, granted, the thymus gland may not be a lymphatic organ everyone can relate to, but the tonsils...
Well, Jimmy, it looks like those tonsils will have to come out.
Are they swollen?
No, but your mom overbought 12 quarts of Butterbrickle ice cream. And ice cream soothes tonsil pain.
Really?
Yes. Or so the Brady Bunch would have us believe.
Yes, it's true. The tonsils are part of the lymphatic system. They're mucosa associated. You know, malt.
The tonsils are located throughout the throat. But, contrary to popular belief, the tonsil's only purpose is not to be taken out. The tonsils help remove bacteria from the body.
And then there's Peyer's patches. Peyer's patches are structures that are similar to tonsils, but are found in the small intestines.
Do you get ice cream if you remove your Peyer's patches?
No, you would die a painful death. But on the lighter side, you could be buried with ice cream.
You see, Peyer's patches are found in the wall of the small intestines. Like the tonsils, they prevent bacteria from breaking into the intestinal wall and spreading to other regions.
And that's the Peyer's patches. Pretty serious job for something that sounds like a Beatrix Potter book.
Well, we've pretty much covered all the lymphatic structures. I hope you've gained a newfound respect for the lymphatic system. I didn't want to have to do this, but the following are a few common disorders that can affect the lymphatic system.
Edema.
A lot of you probably think that you have an ant edema. Well, unless your ant is a swelling of tissue due to inadequate lymph drainage, you're mistaken. That's what edema is, swelling due to poor lymph drainage. Just one display of the formidable power of the lymphatic system.
Elephantiasis.
Elephantiasis is a tropical disease that affects the lymphatic system.
Elephantiasis is caused by parasitic worms that block lymph vessels, causing massive swelling in the scrotum.
Well, I sincerely hope you have a little more respect for the lymphatic system now, because that ends our discussion of the circulatory system. You learned about the cardiovascular system, heart vessels and all, and you learned about the lymphatic system and all its trappings. What more could you ask for?
Part 2, the respiratory system.
Ah, the respiratory system. It provides cells with life-giving oxygen while removing deadly carbon dioxide at the same time. I suppose that's overstatement. Carbon dioxide isn't deadly, but it is annoying. And isn't that enough? Why don't we explain the mechanics of respiration?
Section A. Intro to respiration.
The act of respiration can be broken down into 4 distinct and easy steps. These steps are pulmonary ventilation, external respiration, respiratory gas transport, and internal respiration. Pulmonary ventilation is the actual movement of air in and out of the lungs. When you breathe in and breathe out, it's called pulmonary ventilation. Breathing in is called inspiration, and breathing out is called expiration.
The second stage of respiration is external respiration, which is the gas exchange between the blood and the lungs. This stage is followed by the third stage, which is known as respiratory gas transport. This is the movement of gases like oxygen and carbon dioxide throughout the body via the blood in the circulatory system.
Before you get confused, let me explain the whole gas-blood relationship. You see, 99% of the body's oxygen is transported by binding itself to tiny molecules known as hemoglobin. Hemoglobin molecules are found within red blood cells. The other 1% of the body's oxygen is dissolved in the sticky blood plasma. On the other side of the coin, up to 70% of the body's carbon dioxide, or as I call it, the evil gas, is transported directly in the blood plasma, and only a little bit is bound to hemoglobin.
Finally, the last stage of respiration is known as internal respiration. This is where gas is exchanged between blood and the cells in the body.
Now, there's actually a whole lot more to explain about gas exchange in the blood, but you don't have to know about it right now. This is anatomy, not physiology.
Well, there you have it. The 4 easy steps of respiration. Pulmonary ventilation, external respiration, respiratory gas transport, and internal respiration.
Isn't respiration that much more exciting when you know the actual process? Man, it is great to be alive.
The brainstem, which we discussed in the Anatomically Correct World of Anatomy Part 1, can regulate and control our respiration unconsciously. If we couldn't breathe unconsciously, distractions as common as a cat nap or an exciting episode of Newhart would suffocate us.
But luckily, barring any unforeseen brainstem damage, your respiration will always be unconscious. So, breathe those worries away and concentrate on learning about the different structures that make up the respiratory system.
Section B. Components of the respiratory system.
Every person's respiratory system is divided into two zones, the conducting zone and the respiratory zone.
The first zone we'll discuss is the conducting zone. The conducting zone has an impressive job. It transports, purifies, and humidifies incoming air. Now, what else could possibly do all that?
What the conducting zone does contain is the nose, pharynx, larynx, trachea, and bronchial tree.
The nose.
The nose is made up of an external portion and a nasal cavity. The external portion is the visible portion. You know, the part that's either cute or made fun of in high school. It's supported by bone and cartilage. The nasal cavity is divided into two internal cavities that are separated by a medial nasal septum. You know, the wall that separates the two holes?
The inner walls of the nose are lined with a membrane called the mucous membrane. This membrane contains tiny cells called goblet cells that secrete mucus.
You mean boogies?
No, I mean mucus. Mucus filters, warms, and moistens the air that enters the nose. Mucus is your friend as long as it doesn't filter, warm, and moisten your finger.
The pharynx.
The pharynx is a fancy name for throat. The pharynx is connected superiorly, or at its upper part, to the cavities in your mouth and nose. It connects inferiorly, or by its lower section, to the larynx.
The larynx.
The larynx is a fancy name for the voice box. It's connected to the pharynx above and the trachea below.
The larynx is made up of 9 cartilages, meaning it consists of 9 individual pieces of cartilage connected by membranes and ligaments. The larynx gives us an airway, a switching mechanism for food, and helps with speech production.
Now, the opening to the larynx is called the laryngeal opening, or glottis. This opening indirectly leads to the lungs. It's also really close to the opening of the esophagus, which leads to the stomach. Because of this, the body needs some protection to prevent food from choking us. That's where the epiglottis comes in. One of the cartilages found in the larynx is the epiglottis. This structure is a spoon-shaped flap of cartilage that closes the opening of the larynx during swallowing, so the epiglottis prevents large pieces of steak, quarters, and whole goldfish from choking us when we swallow them on a dare. In fact, it pretty much allows us to eat without dying a horrible choking death.
The trachea.
The larynx is connected inferiorly to the trachea, better known as the windpipe.
The walls of the trachea are made up of C-shaped cartilages. Also inside the walls of the trachea are smooth muscle and connective tissue. This makeup allows the trachea, like a schoolteacher with a personality disorder, to be flexible and rigid at the same time.
Like the nasal cavity, the trachea is coated with a layer of mucus. It's also ciliated. This means it's covered in cilia, tiny little grass-like fibers that help move mucus along. The mucus and cilia combine to push debris toward the nasal cavity and the oral cavity, or mouth, to be eliminated. This is known as the mucociliary escalator, which oddly enough sounds like a cool army man toy.
We did this line!
The mucociliary escalator. It's slippery, it's slick, it pushes, it propels, it destroys foreign debris. Mucociliary escalator, mucociliary escalator, mucociliary escalator. Mucociliary escalator not included. The bronchial tree.
The last structure of the conducting zone is the bronchial tree. The bronchial tree begins at the right and left primary bronchi and terminates or ends at the terminal bronchioles. Now, you probably don't know what bronchioles are yet, but don't worry, we'll get to them in a little bit.
The bronchial tree is a branching system of tubes. It connects the trachea to the air sacs of the lungs, which we'll talk about in just a few moments. The branches of the bronchial tree have walls that are made up of smooth muscle. This smooth muscle can relax or contract to make the diameter of the tubes bigger or smaller. When these muscles relax and open up a little bit, it's called bronchiodilation. When they contract, it's called bronchioconstriction.
There are a number of conditions that can affect the bronchial tree. Asthma, for instance.
Asthma is a form of dyspnea, which is another word for shortness of breath. It's caused by spasms of the smooth muscle layer of the bronchial tree. These spasms can make breathing very difficult.
Another well-known bronchial condition is bronchitis. Bronchitis is inflammation of the walls of the bronchial tubes. This inflammation holds up the flow of air through the bronchial tubes and makes you feel like you're breathing through a wet blanket.
Musty. Well, there you have it, the conducting zone. It's the first part of the respiratory system, but certainly not the last. Because you see, the adventure is far from over. In fact, it's just begun.
The respiratory zone.
There's nothing that tastes better than mountaintop air, even if that mountain is a low-budget video effect. And there's nothing I like to talk about more than the respiratory zone.
The respiratory zone is where gas exchange occurs. This area includes the lungs and all of their components.
The respiratory zone is made up of the respiratory bronchioles, the alveolar ducts and sacs, the alveoli, and respiratory membranes. We'll tackle these structures one at a time.
The respiratory bronchioles are small tubes at the termini, or ends, of the bronchial tree. They have little air sacs called alveoli attached to their external walls. The alveolar ducts are smaller structures that branch out from the respiratory bronchioles. These alveolar ducts are also lined with alveoli on their outside surface. The alveolar sacs are collections of alveoli at the termini, or ends, of the ducts.
I bet you're wondering what the alveoli are. Well, this might clear things up for you. Oh, that's real funny. Come on, I'm wearing a parka here.
The alveoli are microscopic air sacs that fill the interior of the lungs. These alveoli are in direct contact with the pulmonary capillaries of the circulatory system. You remember capillaries. They're tiny blood vessels. The alveoli are where the actual exchange of gas occurs with the blood. And because there's over 300 million alveoli, there's plenty of surface area for gas exchange.
Another section of the respiratory zone is the respiratory membrane.
The respiratory membrane is a thin membrane on the outside surfaces of the alveoli. This membrane is made up of fused alveolar and capillary walls. Gases like carbon dioxide and oxygen are exchanged across this membrane.
Lungs, the end-all and be-all of respiration.
Now, this is just ridiculous. Why am I wearing this? Well, anyway, the lungs are the organs that house a lot of the structures we've been talking about.
The lungs are paired organs found inside the pleural cavities. The pleural cavities are inside the thoracic cavity. The lungs are made up of bronchioles, alveoli, arteries, veins, and capillaries all wrapped up in a lovely elastic tissue. The lungs are flexible, and this makes breathing easier.
A funny thing about the human lungs is that the right lung has 3 lobes and the left lung has only 2. This allows room for the heart, the bulk of which is located to the left of the body's midline. It also allows me to call the left lung the wimpy lung.
Each lung is also surrounded by a double-layered sac-like structure called the pleural membrane, or pleura. The pleurae help prevent the spread of infection. The lubricating fluid they produce reduces friction as the lungs move during pulmonary ventilation.
In case you're confused, pulmonary ventilation is the scientific word for breathing. But don't worry, we'll delve into that soon enough.
The thing I love most about the fresh mountain air is that I never think about lung sicknesses and disorders. And unfortunately, there are a few nasty ones to think about. Stuff like asthma, which we discussed, and emphysema.
Emphysema is a disease that affects the alveoli of the lungs. Emphysema occurs when the alveoli rupture and disintegrate. This is often caused by prolonged tobacco smoking.
The disintegration of alveoli usually results in the loss of elasticity of the lungs. For people with emphysema, breathing is a chore that often leads to exhaustion or even suffocation.
Oh, come on, you've got to be kidding me. Well, now that you know about the actual structures in the conducting and respiratory zones, you're ready to leap into the actual mechanics of pulmonary ventilation.
Hey, Slim, how are you?
Good.
Great. Could you move to the right a little?
Yeah, sure. How's this?
Perfect. Now, could you breathe like you normally would?
I'm doing that now.
Perfect.
Section C, Mechanics of Pulmonary Ventilation.
Pulmonary ventilation is the long-winded term for breathing. I breathe in, I breathe out. That's pulmonary ventilation. Is that clear?
The process of pulmonary ventilation is dependent on volume and pressure changes in the thoracic cavity. These relationships are based on Boyle's law, which states that volume is inversely proportional to pressure. That means that when volume increases, pressure decreases, and vice versa. If you want to know more about Boyle's law, it's discussed in depth in the Supercharged World of Chemistry Part 3. Buy it, view it, buy it again. But for now, concentrate on pulmonary ventilation.
All right, Slim, do you need a snack or anything?
No, thanks. I'm fine.
Perfect. Can you breathe in as hard as possible?
Is this what we're doing today?
Slim?
Pulmonary ventilation can be divided into two processes, inspiration and expiration. We'll talk about inspiration first.
You put air right in my lungs. You're the inspiration.
Inspiration is the period when air is flowing into the lungs, also known as inhaling. This is a really active process, which requires the full cooperation and contraction of all the inspiratory muscles, like the diaphragm and external intercostals.
During inspiration, these inspiratory muscles contract in order to increase intrathoracic volume. That's volume inside the thoracic cavity. So these muscles flatten when they contract, and the volume of the thoracic cavity increases. As this volume increases, the pleural lining and lungs are pulled along with it. So as the cavity expands, so do the lungs.
So, due to Boyle's law, the pressure inside of the lungs decreases. This makes the pressure inside the lungs lower than the pressure outside the lungs. In order to equalize pressure in the lungs with atmospheric pressure, air moves into the lungs from the atmosphere until an equilibrium is reached.
And that's inspiration. Pretty simple, huh?
Yes. Almost too simple.
Your suspicion serves you well. There is a catch. You see, this process is a little bit different during forced or deep inspiration. Forced inspiration usually occurs during vigorous exercise.
For instance, if you're doing something really strenuous, like, say, digging up the remains of famous Russian cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin, your body needs more oxygen. So, forced inspiration becomes necessary in order to expand your thoracic cavity and let more air into your lungs.
This extra push requires the combined effort of some extra muscles. These muscles are the pectoralis minor, scalenes, sternocleidomastoid, and erector spinae.
Don't panic. If you don't remember these muscles, just go out and get the Anatomically Correct World of Anatomy Part 1. Otherwise, push on.
When air flows out of the lungs, we call it expiration. This is the other process involved in pulmonary ventilation. It's the opposite of inspiration. In fact, you might call it bizarro inspiration. But most people just call it exhaling. You know, breathing out. Unlike inspiration, expiration is a passive process. This means it depends on the relaxation of inspiratory muscles and on the natural elasticity of the lungs, instead of muscle contractions. That means it takes less work.
That's it. Let it all out. All out. Got it? Good. Now breathe it all back in. All in. That's it. Lots of air for Slim. There we go.
During expiration, the muscles that are used for inspiration relax. This causes the volume inside the thoracic cavity to decrease. Then, because the lung tissue is so elastic, the volume inside the lungs also decreases. When this happens, pressure inside the lungs increases and rises above atmospheric pressure. After this, air moves out of the lungs and into the atmosphere to establish equilibrium.
Pretty neat, huh?
He's holding something back. I can see it in his eyes.
Perhaps I'm not telling you the whole story. Forced expiration is a little bit different from standard, quiet, calm expiration. For one, forced expiration is an active process. Certain muscles have to contract in order to do it.
During forced expiration, muscles contract in order to increase abdominal pressure and depress the rib cage. This decreases the volume inside the thoracic cavity even further. The muscles that contract are the internal intercostals and the internal and external obliques. Coincidentally, these muscles were discussed in the Anatomically Correct World of Anatomy, Part 1. Anyway, these muscles contract to decrease the volume in the thoracic cavity. This increases the pressure in the thoracic cavity.
Forced expiration is used when we need controlled and rhythmic movement of air out of the lungs, like when we sing or speak, or panic in fear at the ghost of Yuri Gagarin.
Нет.
I didn't mean it! I didn't mean it!
Нет.
One frightening condition that affects pulmonary ventilation is atelectasis, or lung collapse.
This happens when air enters the space around the lungs called the pleural cavity. This usually occurs through a severe chest wound.
When this occurs, the pressure around the lungs is the same as the pressure in the atmosphere. This prevents the lungs from expanding, and then, lo and behold, lung collapse.
Part 3. The digestive system.
Uncle Frank, you are a nutty, crazy man. None of these people are my family. In fact, they don't know me, and I've invaded their picnic. But they've been gracious enough to let me be around them and their food while we explain the intricacies of the digestive system.
We've all heard of the digestive system. We know its job is to break down food and absorb nutrients.
Once the digestive system breaks down this food, it can be absorbed by the body for nourishment.
In this part of the tape, you'll learn all about the organs involved in digestion. But that's not all. I will actually demonstrate digestion by eating. This entire watermelon, 3/4 of this apple pie, and a whole Cornish hen. So you can check back with me every now and again as you're learning about the organs of the digestive system.
The digestive system can be broken down into two sections. First, there's the alimentary canal, or gastrointestinal tract. This can be called the GI tract for short. Then there's the digestive accessory organs. We'll look at the gastrointestinal tract first.
Section A, the gastrointestinal tract.
The gastrointestinal, or GI tract, is an open-ended tube that food passes through. This food gets digested and absorbed along the way. The GI tract is divided into 6 regions: the oral cavity, the pharynx, the esophagus, the stomach, the small intestine, and the large intestine. The act of digestion begins in the oral cavity, otherwise known as the mouth.
The oral cavity, or mouth, is the place where food gets chewed up by the teeth. The technical term for chewing is mastication. For all normal people, it's the first place that food enters the body. Abnormal people may put food elsewhere, but they will not be discussed in this tape. When food gets masticated and mixed with saliva in the oral cavity, it's rolled into a soft, mushy ball by the tongue. This food ball is called a bolus. The tongue, teeth, and salivary glands are all digestive accessory organs associated with the oral cavity, and they're all responsible for bolus formation.
American League Bolus Ball. It's fantastic.
Good evening, I'm Marv Talbot, and this is Walt Filton.
And you're watching the American League Bolus Ball Championship. It's a championship for champions. That's why it's a championship.
Yes, today Elias Walker, Bolus Ball champion, will send a bolus that was once 3 slices of swirl rye bread rocketing down his gastrointestinal tract.
Exciting stuff, Marv. Walker learned to chew in the inner city and then went pro at age 17. Now, let's check in with Elias Walker, ready to turn bread into bolus.
Yes!
It looks as though Walker is exercising his tongue, an important muscle that helps form the bolus. Walker's tongue, like every tongue, is a mucus-covered skeletal muscle that shapes and softens food by working with the teeth. Adults have 32 permanent teeth.
The teeth are responsible for mastication, or simply put, chewing. Right, Marv?
I'm still stuck on mucus-covered skeletal muscle. Yuck! Let's check in now again with Bolus Ball champion, Elias Walker.
It looks as though Walker has begun chewing the bread, his tongue forming it into a bolus with the help of moisture from the salivary glands.
That's right, Marv. Right now, his salivary glands are thinking about one thing: salivating. We'll be right back.
The salivary glands are very important in the early stages of digestion. The salivary glands secrete saliva via small ducts to moisten food.
These glands secrete saliva filled with enzymes and other substances. The saliva is responsible for the initial digestion of carbohydrates.
After the saliva, teeth, and tongue form a moist bolus in the mouth, we swallow the bolus. Another name for swallowing is deglutition.
Welcome back. Elias Walker has just swallowed the bolus.
That's right, Walt. But now the real challenge begins as the bolus passes into the next part of the gastrointestinal tract, the pharynx or throat. Let's get a close-up of Walker's pharynx.
Well, that's boring and reveals nothing. Let's now turn to an artist's rendition of Walker's pharynx. That also tells us nothing. Let's look at a real diagram. Yes! As you can see, the pharynx is connected to the oral cavity and uses its muscles to propel food downward towards the esophagus. Inside the pharynx, bacteria contained in the bolus can be destroyed by the tonsils. Tonsils are also tissues in the lymphatic system.
That's great digestive action, just like back in the 70s when I used to digest.
It sure is, Walt, but you and I both know that the greatest bolus ball challenge is yet to come.
That's right. After the bolus hits the pharynx, it passes into the esophagus or food tube. So Walker is really in the zone now.
Yes.
The esophagus is the tube that transports the bolus directly to the stomach.
The esophagus drops the bolus through the gastroesophageal sphincter into the stomach. Basically, it's just a passageway to the stomach.
Welcome back. The bolus is now in Walker's stomach, and the stomach is a pretty exciting place, isn't it?
Oh yes, it's full of acidic juices that are juice-like. Walker is on fire.
Yes!
When the bolus hits the stomach, watch out. It's goodbye bolus, hello chyme. This is the final inning of bolus ball. We'll be right back.
You see, when the bolus reaches the stomach, it stores the bolus for a while.
Then, the stomach begins a chemical breakdown of proteins inside the food. This breakdown turns the bolus into chyme. Chyme is a disgusting, creamy paste of semi-digested food. It's in the stomach where protein digestion begins.
Well, that's the end of the bolus and the end of the first part of digestion.
Nowhere to go but down at this point.
Now, let's check back with bolus ball champion Elias Walker, still digesting.
Yes! It looks as though the bolus has hit Walker's stomach. Now we play the waiting game. He'll sit there like a slug for a few hours while it digests.
Oh, hello again. My stomach is full of watermelon and game bird. How are you? Oh, don't answer that. Instead, concentrate on the next part of digestion that occurs in the intestines.
The first part of the intestine is the small intestine.
After the stomach turns the bolus into chyme, that chyme passes into the small intestine through a muscular structure called the pyloric sphincter.
The small intestine is the longest part of the gastrointestinal tract. It's responsible for chemical digestion and the absorption of carbohydrates, proteins, and lipids or fats. It also absorbs 7 liters of the 9 liters of water it encounters in a day. You don't really have to worry about the details of the process of absorbing water. Save that for physiology.
The small intestine can be broken up into 3 regions: the duodenum, the jejunum, and the ileum.
The duodenum is about 10 inches long and begins at the pyloric sphincter. It's the first section of the small intestine. The duodenum receives a bunch of important digestive juices, like bile and enzymes, from digestive accessory organs like the liver, the gallbladder, and the pancreas. But don't worry about these organs just yet, because they'll be coming up again.
The jejunum is the next section of the small intestines. It's about 8 feet long. That's pretty long. If it were human and had basketball skills, it could play for the Clippers.
The ileum is the final section of the small intestine. The ileum terminates at a structure known as the ileocecal valve. The ileocecal valve is like a little partition that separates the small intestine from the large intestine. The ileocecal valve opens up to let food into the large intestine and keeps food from backtracking into the small intestine. So, it kind of works like the valves in the heart. All total, the ileum is 12 feet long. If it had basketball skills, it would be a freakishly scary NBA player, taller than the net.
The next major part of the digestive system, and my favorite part, is the large intestine. Oh God, I love it.
The large intestine forms the end or terminal end of the gastrointestinal tract. The large intestine is actually only 5 feet long, but it's wider than the small intestine. That's why we call it large. Still, it's not large enough to become an NBA player, nor is it short enough to become a lovable child star, like Canadian Phil Steuben.
The large intestine absorbs 90% of the remaining water from indigestible food. That's about 2 liters of water. When too much water is absorbed by the large intestines, we get constipated. When too little is absorbed, we get diarrhea. Either way, the semi-solid indigestible food residue left over is called feces. In any event, the large intestine has 3 sections: the cecum, the colon, and the rectum.
The first section of the large intestine is known as the cecum. The cecum is continuous with the ileum of the small intestine. It's separated from the small intestine by the ileocecal valve.
There is an appendage on the medial surface of the cecum called the appendix. The appendix contains lymphatic tissue nicknamed MALT. MALT stands for mucosa-associated lymph tissue. This tissue helps eliminate bacteria.
The appendix has a twisted shape. Because of this, fecal matter full of bacteria builds up and becomes trapped there. When this happens, the appendix becomes infected and inflamed, and it's hello appendicitis.
The cecum leads into the colon, which forms a frame around the small intestine.
The colon forms a rectangular-like frame around the small intestines. Under normal circumstances, the large intestine would make a pretty disgusting frame. But in this case, it works just fine. The side of this frame, located on the right side of the abdominal cavity, extending out of the cecum, is called the ascending colon. The top, horizontal part of the frame is called the transverse colon. The part located on the left side of the abdominal cavity is called the descending colon. And finally, the bottom part of the frame that leads into the rectum is called the sigmoid colon, a name for Dr. Sigmund Freud.
The last section in both the large intestines and the gastrointestinal tract is the rectum.
The end of the rectum is called the anal canal. The anal canal is equipped with muscular sphincters that control the defecation process.
And we're nearing the end of the gastrointestinal tract as we approach the anus.
Actually, the rectum springs directly out of the sigmoid colon and leads to the anal opening, or anus. The very end of the GI tract is in the anus.
That's the end of the gastrointestinal tract. But before we move on to talk about the accessory organs, why don't you digest this?
And now, a blatantly untrue anatomical tidbit.
Did you know that in Cuba, the gastrointestinal tract is actually called the gastrointestinal tract? And that's a blatant untruth.
Section B, the accessory organs.
There are 6 accessory organs involved in the digestive process. Each one of them serves a different purpose. The first 3 we've already talked about. They are the teeth, the tongue, and the salivary glands. The teeth and most of the tongue are found in the oral cavity.
The major salivary glands are called extrinsic salivary glands. They're found in, or just outside of, the oral cavity. They are connected to the oral cavity by ducts.
The other 3 organs are the liver, the gallbladder, and the pancreas. These organs are all associated with the duodenum, the first section of the small intestines.
The liver is the largest gland in the body. It's a red, 4-lobed gland that weighs about 3 pounds in the average adult. The bulk of the liver is to the right of the body's midline. It's almost completely surrounded by the rib cage. The liver also produces bile, a gooey yellow-green liquid that's full of salt, pigments, and lipids. Bile helps the body break down fat.
The liver also enjoys removing nutrients from the blood, storing vitamins, detoxifying waste, and taking long walks on the beach.
The gallbladder is another accessory digestive organ.
The gallbladder is a green, 4-inch long muscular sac located in the lower right surface of the liver. Bile made in the liver travels into the gallbladder via the bile duct. So the gallbladder is kind of like a bile storage center.
It's the Fort Knox of the body.
It stores excess bile, then it concentrates bile by absorbing water out of it. Finally, it delivers bile to the duodenum of the small intestines. It does this by contracting and discharging bile into the cystic duct. Then the cystic duct connects with the bile duct to form the common bile duct,
which eventually leads to the duodenum of the small intestines by way of the hepatopancreatic duct.
And lastly, there's the pancreas, another accessory digestive organ. The pancreas cooks up most of the enzymes needed for digestion. Actually, the pancreas produces both digestive enzymes and hormones. We'll tell you more about hormones a little later on when we talk about the endocrine system.
The pancreas is a yellowish tadpole-shaped gland. Its cells produce pancreatic juice, which contains tons of digestive enzymes. Pancreatic juice is delivered to the duodenum by way of the hepatopancreatic duct. Pancreatic juice is also the third most popular beverage in the United States. For crazy people.
Drink it up, drink it's pancreatic. Juice it up, juice is pancreatic. Juice is pancreatic. Juice. Juicerific!
Hello, I'm sluggish. And now, just as you're done learning about the digestive system, I'm done eating more watermelon and poultry than any man alive. I've gorged myself, and you've learned about the gastrointestinal tract and the accessory organs. Now, you can go on to learn about the urinary system, while I sit here and wait for my digestive system to flush itself out.
Flush itself out! Yes!
That's fantastic digestive action, it really is!
The urinary system, vital janitor of the human body, forever striving to rid our body of what children call pee, but what adults call pee.
The urinary system is our friend. No matter how many times it wakes you up in the middle of the night, remember, the urinary system is working for you. Its main job is to constantly remove waste from our bodies by forming urine. It also maintains normal blood composition. So just like a water purification plant filters bad stuff out of water, the urinary system filters waste from the fluids in our bodies and returns good stuff to our blood. The whole urinary system is made up of a pair of kidneys, a pair of ureters, a single urinary bladder, and a single urethra. We'll tackle the kidneys first.
Section A, the kidneys and urethra.
The kidneys are two bean-shaped organs. They're located in the superior lumbar region, an area discussed in the Anatomically Correct World of Anatomy, Part 1.
There are three regions in the kidney: the outer renal cortex, the middle renal medulla, and the inner renal pelvis. The kidneys are responsible for removing nitrogenous waste. That's waste that contains nitrogen. The kidneys remove these wastes by forming urine. This maintains a healthy acid-base fluid balance in the blood.
The main structures that make up the kidneys are tiny blood processing units called nephrons. They are the functional units of the kidneys, the workhorses, you might say. These little nephrons carry out the processes that form urine. And who could ask for a more fulfilling job?
There are over 1 million nephrons in each kidney. Each nephron is made up of a renal corpuscle and a renal tubule.
The renal corpuscle is responsible for glomerular filtration. Glomerular filtration is the first process in urine formation. The renal corpuscle is made up of two structures, the glomerulus and another structure called the glomerular, or Bowman's capsule.
Now, while the glomerulus may sound like a race of different-looking, and therefore evil, creatures from Star Trek, it's not. The glomerulus is actually a small tuft of capillaries. The glomerulus is surrounded by a capsule which is attached to the renal tubule, a structure that we'll give you the details on in just a moment.
The glomerular, or Bowman's capsule, is the other part of the renal corpuscle. Basically, it's a large cup-like structure that completely surrounds and engulfs the glomerulus, kind of like how a broken-in baseball glove engulfs a baseball. And don't forget, Bowman's capsule and the glomerulus also form the renal corpuscle, and it's in this section where the filtration of blood takes place. To sum it up, inside the renal corpuscle, bad stuff go bye-bye.
Just remember that the renal corpuscle is in charge of the glomerular filtration. You don't have to know that much detail, because hey, this is anatomy, not physiology. In any event, you do know about the glomerulus now. But still, that's only one of the structures that makes up a nephron. Another structure is the renal tubule.
The renal tubule's job is to selectively reabsorb water and substances, like sodium, potassium, calcium, and other important stuff that's needed by the body. It also secretes waste no longer needed by the body.
The renal tubule is divided up into three regions.
These regions are the twisty-turny proximal convoluted tubule, the U-shaped loop of Henle, and the twisty-turny distal convoluted tubule.
The proximal convoluted tubule, or PCT, is the highly coiled region of the renal tubule that is continuous with the glomerular capsule.
Connected to the PCT is the loop of Henle. The loop of Henle is a hairpin loop that links both convoluted tubules, the PCT, and the distal convoluted tubule, or DCT for short. The portion extending from the PCT is called the descending limb of the loop of Henle. The portion connected to the distal convoluted tubule, or DCT, is the ascending limb of the loop of Henle. The distal convoluted tubule, or DCT, emerges from the loop of Henle and forms the final region of the renal tubule. In all of these tubules, water continues to be absorbed and waste continues to be deposited.
We're not going into detail on the formation of urine, so don't feel like you're missing anything. If you want to know more about urine, send a self-addressed stamped envelope to Fun with Urine, 2890 Emma Lee Street, Falls Church, Virginia, 22042. You'll be glad you did.
Well, that's the end of the renal tubule. Now, I know there's a lot of confusing loops, tubules, twists, and turns in the renal tubule, but that's because the extra length these curves create allows the renal tubule to process waste more effectively. More surface area means more filtration. So, do yourself and the renal tubule a favor and rewind the tape if you're confused or need a review.
When the urine formed in the renal tubules exits the DCT, it's delivered to a collecting duct. The collecting duct collects urine. Wow, what a great hobby.
The collecting duct collects urine from the DCTs of a whole lot of nephrons. You see, the millions of nephrons in your kidneys all have DCTs that empty out into collecting ducts. These collecting ducts deliver the urine to the renal pelvis. Then it flows into a ureter. Remember, each kidney has a ureter, so you have 2 ureters. But unfortunately, before we move on to the ureters, we have to talk about severe kidney disorders.
Sometimes, when a lot of nephrons are damaged or can't function right, a condition known as renal failure occurs. When this happens, people have to undergo dialysis, where they are placed on a machine called a dialysis machine.
Hemodialysis is the most common form of dialysis. In this process, blood is rerouted through a machine that contains a semi-permeable membrane suspended in a bathing solution. The membrane removes wastes from the blood and traps them in a bathing solution. Important substances the body needs can re-enter the blood from the bathing solution. Sometimes, in cases even more severe than this, a kidney transplant is required.
It's true. Renal failure is frightening. But never forget, all those other times when your kidneys are working, that's renal success. And now, on to the ureters.
There's not really much one can say about the ureters. They're really thin. They conduct urine from the kidneys to the urinary bladder. Pretty simple, huh? Now, the kidneys are an important part of the urinary system, but the precious urine they create would have no place to go were it not for the worm-like ureters, the cavernous urinary bladder, and the muscular urethra.
Section B, the urinary bladder and the urethra.
The urinary bladder and the urethra are the last few rest stops for urine on that highway of relief.
The bladder is a collapsible muscular sac that lies just behind and below the pubic symphysis. The pubic symphysis is the cartilage that connects the 2 sides of the pelvis. The bladder's prime job is to temporarily store the urine that's constantly being produced by the kidneys.
The next adventure on the urine itinerary is the urethra. The urethra is a muscular tube that transports urine from the bladder to the outside world so that everyone can enjoy it. All people.
The urethra contains 2 muscular structures called sphincters. It has an internal urethral sphincter made up of smooth muscle. The internal urethral sphincter is under involuntary control, meaning you can't control it consciously. The other sphincter in the urethra is the external urethral sphincter. It's made up of skeletal muscle and under voluntary control. We'll go into more details on the sphincters in a sec. Just let us elaborate on the urethra for a bit longer.
At 8 inches, the male urethra is a lot longer than the 1.5-inch female urethra. The male urethra also conducts urine and semen, while the female urethra conducts only urine. Well, that's the bladder and the urethra. You should be thankful for these organs. They make micturition, the act of emptying the bladder, possible.
You see, when the bladder fills up with urine, its smooth muscle contracts, causing the internal sphincter to open wide.
So if you're not ready to go because you're in church, running a road race, or dancing with your prom date, Your body helps buy you some time.
We can use our external sphincter to temporarily delay the release of urine. You know, hold it in. This is because the external sphincter is under voluntary control.
Unfortunately, this little trick can only work for so long because the external sphincter will eventually give way to building pressure and then Niagara Falls. But hey, we're lucky we even have the ability to hold it in, and sometimes we take it for granted. Urinary incontinence is the inability to voluntarily control urination.
Urinary incontinence is normal in infants because babies haven't developed control over their voluntary external sphincter.
Unfortunately, incontinence in adults is usually caused by emotional trauma, pressure from the uterus during pregnancy, and nervous system disorders like multiple sclerosis. So if you're healthy, be thankful for your healthy urethra, as well as your bladder, kidneys, and ureters. By Job, be thankful for your entire urinary system, even on those cold winter nights when nature calls.
Part 5, the endocrine system.
The endocrine system does a lot of important jobs and gets none of the glory. Think about it. There's a bumper sticker that says, "I heart my mom," but are there ever any that say, "I thyroid gland my mom"? The respiratory system inspired the phrase, "You take my breath away." But does anyone ever say, "You regulate my growth"? No.
The endocrine system is an unsung hero that regulates reproduction, growth, immunity, and all other processes occurring in the body. Basically, it maintains a stable environment for the body called homeostasis. This environment helps all the other organs of all the other systems to function properly. But all you have to know is that without the endocrine system, there'd be no life.
Still, the endocrine system never gets the credit it's due. But today, it will.
Section A, organs of the endocrine system.
The super exciting organs of the endocrine system are small and dispersed throughout the body, and they're all responsible for producing chemicals called hormones.
Hormones are sort of like chemical messengers. They are secreted into and carried by the bloodstream. Then the hormones travel to individual target cells that they act on. In other words, they bind to specific receptors on target cells to alter the cell's activity.
The major endocrine organs are the pituitary gland, the thyroid gland, the parathyroid gland, the adrenal gland, the pancreas, the gonads, the pineal gland, and the thymus.
People sometimes call the pituitary gland the master gland because hormones released by it direct the activity of almost all other endocrine organs.
The pituitary gland is located below the hypothalamus. It's connected to the hypothalamus by the infundibulum, which is a funnel-shaped stalk structure.
If you're confused about what the hypothalamus is, it's part of the diencephalon of the brain, and it's discussed in the Anatomically Correct World of Anatomy, Part 1, in the section on the brain. All you really have to remember is that the hypothalamus produces hormones.
The pituitary gland can be divided into two regions, the posterior and anterior lobes.
The posterior lobe is made up of nerve fibers and acts as a storage area for two hormones produced by the hypothalamus. One of these hormones is oxytocin, which initiates uterine contractions during parturition, or labor, as most people know it.
Another hormone is the antidiuretic hormone, or ADH. The main function of ADH is to stimulate the reabsorption of water from the collecting tubules. ADH is also known as vasopressin.
The anterior lobe of the pituitary gland is made up of a glandular tissue that manufactures a whole heap of hormones called tropic hormones. They are, now brace yourself because this is a mouthful.
The cells that produce the tropic hormones are the somatotrophs, the thyrotrophs, the corticotrophs, the lactotrophs, and the gonadotrophs. The somatotrophs include the growth hormone, or GH. The thyrotrophs include the thyroid-stimulating hormone, or TSH. The corticotrophs include the adrenocorticotrophic hormone, or ACTH. The gonadotrophs include the follicle-stimulating hormone, or FSH, and the luteinizing hormone, or LH. And finally, the lactotrophs include prolactin.
Now, you want to hear the details?
Do we have a choice?
Well, to cut you a break, we'll only give you the details on one of those hormones, GH, the growth hormone. The rest you can learn about in physiology.
GH stimulates normal growth in bone and muscles. If the anterior lobe secretes too much or too little of this hormone, it can cause some pretty serious problems.
For example, if too little GH is present during childhood, dwarfism can occur. If there's too much GH in children, gigantism occurs. Too much GH in adults, as in the case of our 16th president, Abe Lincoln, causes acromegaly. This causes abnormally large hands, feet, and facial features, which worked for Lincoln but doesn't work for everybody.
We'll talk about the thyroid gland next.
The thyroid gland is a butterfly-shaped organ located in the neck, anterior to, or in front of, the trachea.
Basically, the thyroid hormones increase metabolic rate or oxygen consumption in most cells of the body, and calcitonin regulates calcium.
The next major endocrine organ is the parathyroid gland.
The parathyroid glands are tiny glands embedded in the back of the thyroid gland. They secrete parathyroid hormone, or PTH, which is important in calcium and phosphate regulation.
The adrenal glands.
The adrenal glands are triangular-shaped glands located on the top of each kidney. Each adrenal gland is actually made up of two endocrine glands, the outer adrenal cortex and the inner adrenal medulla.
The outer adrenal cortex secretes three groups of hormones known as glucocorticoids, mineralocorticoids, and androgens. You don't have to know about these hormones in detail until you study physiology. The inner adrenal medulla is made up of nervous tissue. It secretes the catecholamines, which are made up of hormones epinephrine and norepinephrine.
Ladies and gentlemen, the pancreas.
The pancreas, which we discussed with the digestive system, is a yellowish tadpole-shaped gland located near the duodenum of the small intestine. Aside from aiding in digestion, the pancreas produces the hormones insulin, glucagon, and somatostatin. These hormones are responsible for the regulation of glucose in the body.
The gonads.
Both males and females have gonads. In females, the gonads are called the ovaries. In males, the gonads are called the testes. We'll breeze over the gonads now, but we'll cover them in more detail when we talk about the reproductive system.
Basically, the gonads produce sex hormones that regulate reproductive functions. In females, these sex hormones are estrogen and progesterone.
In males, the hormones produced by the testes are called androgens. The most popular and important male androgen is testosterone.
We'll go into more detail on these sex hormones when we talk about the reproductive system.
The pineal gland.
The pineal gland, though it may sound dirty, is really just a pea-sized gland located in the brain.
Pineal gland produces melatonin, a hormone many scientists think is responsible for diurnal or sleep-wake cycles. This is because melatonin production is at its peak level in the middle of the night and at its lowest level in the middle of the day. Because of this, experts infer that light levels affect melatonin.
The thymus gland.
The thymus gland is located posterior to or behind the sternum.
The thymus gland regresses with age, which basically means it's larger and more noticeable in infants than in adults. The thymus gland produces the two major hormones, thymosin and thymopoietin. These hormones help T lymphocytes mature and become immunocompetent, or ready to do their job within the immune system. In case you don't remember, T lymphocytes are involved in your immune system.
Other important endocrine structures.
There are also a bunch of organs that belong to other systems, but also pull some weight in the endocrine system. These organs are the heart, the kidneys, and the gastrointestinal tract.
The heart produces the hormone atrial natriuretic peptide, which decreases blood pressure.
The kidneys produce erythropoietin, a hormone that increases red blood cell production.
The gastrointestinal tract produces a whole bunch of digestive hormones like gastrin and cholecystokinin. These hormones regulate digestion.
And finally, the skin produces a chemical called cholecalciferol. Cholecalciferol is a precursor to vitamin D3. Active vitamin D3 helps the body absorb calcium.
Well, that's it for the endocrine system.
Part 6, the reproductive system.
Now, the main function of the reproductive system is to produce offspring and perpetuate genes. You know what that means, making babies and handing down traits. But in order to do this, both males and females need certain organs. So before we go into the specifics of male and female anatomy, we'll give you a brief overview of the most important organs.
And now, the gonads, purveyors of life.
The gonads are the primary reproductive organs for both males and females. Male gonads are called testes. Female gonads are called ovaries. The gonads, or as they're referred to in junior high, the nads, are responsible for producing gametes and the sex hormones.
Gametes are, bluntly put, sex cells. The sex cells in males are sperm, and the sex cells in females are ova, or eggs. These two sex cells fuse together to form zygotes. These zygotes will then go on to mature into individual organisms who eat, drool, and enjoy annoying foam dinosaurs.
Sex hormones control the activity and maturation of the reproductive system, as well as a few other organs or tissues. We'll go into a more detailed description of them a little later.
There are also other reproductive organs we'll talk about in this section. Things like accessory glands and external genitalia. These organs have accessory functions that we'll go into in just a little bit.
Section A, male anatomy.
Male anatomy is divided up into the gonads, the male accessory duct system, and the accessory glands of reproduction. We'll start with the gonads.
The testes are the male gonads. They are the primary male sex organs. So, for those of you who thought the penis was a primary sex organ, sorry, you were wrong.
The testes are small, paired oval organs. They're found in the scrotum, a structure we'll fill you in on in just a minute.
The testes produce sperm, which we've already mentioned, and androgens, which are the male sex hormones. The most dominant male sex hormone is testosterone.
Testosterone.
Testosterone is the male hormone that's in charge of reproductive maturation, puberty, the male sex drive, or libido, and last but definitely not least, normal sperm production. Testosterone is even in charge of such Peter Brady-esque secondary reproductive characteristics as the deepening of the voice.
And now, the male duct system. Catch the wave.
The male duct system puts the duct in reproductive. They're what make easy, inexpensive sperm travel possible. The male duct system transports sperm from the testes to the outside world. All told, the duct system is made up of 4 parts: the epididymis, the vas deferens, the ejaculatory duct, and the urethra.
The epididymis is a coiled tube about 1.5 inches long and is found on the posterior surface of each testis. The epididymides receive immature sperm from the testes. The sperm mature and learn to swim as they wiggle through the epididymis for about 20 days.
After leaving the epididymis, the sperm enter the vas deferens, a tube that is about 18 inches long. The vas deferens, along with muscle, blood vessels, and nerves, makes up the spermatic cord. The vas deferens ends in an expanded section known as the ampulla. The ampulla forms part of the ejaculatory duct, the next duct in the duct system.
The ejaculatory duct is formed by the union of the ampullae and a duct from the seminal vesicle, which is a male accessory organ of the reproductive system. We'll give you the details on the seminal vesicle a little later on. Now, the ejaculatory duct passes through a structure called the prostate gland and eventually empties into the urethra.
Funnily enough, the urethra is a switch hitter. It carries both urine and semen and is a part of both the male urinary and reproductive systems. But sperm do always have the right of way over urine. Out of my way, buddy! I've got to be somewhere.
All right already. I'm moving. Jeez.
The urethra is the very end of the male duct system. It carries sperm to the tip of the penis and into the outside world.
Like the wheels and cogs of time itself, the male reproductive accessory glands grind on and on and on.
The male reproductive accessory glands have a messy but important job. The male accessory glands produce a fluid that helps transport the sperm. They also make nutrients and chemicals that nourish, protect, and help sperm move. All these fluids and nutrients, together with sperm, make semen.
Arr!
No, different kind of semen. This semen can also be called seminal fluid. It's a liquid that's 1% sperm and 99% accessory gland secretions. What are those? Glad you asked. The accessory glands are the seminal vesicles, the prostate gland, and the bulbourethral glands.
The seminal vesicles are located posterior to or just behind the bladder. They produce a yellowish, thick fluid that's emptied into the ejaculatory duct.
This magical elixir contains all the nourishment for the sperm and chemicals that help it sneak into the ovum, which is something we'll talk about later.
The prostate gland is found just at the base of the bladder. It produces a milky fluid that's emptied into the urethra. This particular fluid plays a role in sperm mobility.
The bulbourethral glands, also known as the Cowper's glands, are just below the prostate. They produce a thick, clear mucus that drains into the urethra.
This mucus is released right before ejaculation to neutralize traces of acidic urine in the urethra and to provide lubrication. So the bulbourethral gland, the prostate gland, and the seminal vesicle all pitch in to produce semen. But neither the bulbourethral glands or any of this other stuff would have a purpose at all were it not for
Male external genitalia. Catch the wave.
The external male genitalia consists of two structures, the penis and the scrotum. The penis is the male copulatory organ.
The penis is designed to deliver sperm into the female reproductive tract. It's made up of an attached root and a free shaft.
The majority of the penis is made up of erectile tissue, which is a spongy connective tissue.
This erectile tissue fills up with blood during an erection to allow the penis to effortlessly penetrate the vagina.
The scrotum is the final important part of the male external genitalia. The scrotum is a pouch of darkly pigmented skin suspended near the root of the penis, which houses the testes or testicles in two compartments. That's its job.
The scrotum tries to provide an optimal environment for sperm production. It tries to maintain a temperature that's 3 degrees lower than body temperature, so when it's cold, the scrotum can contract, moving the testes closer to the body to keep them warm. When it's hot, on the other hand, the scrotum can hang loose, away from the body, to decrease temperature. Also, inside the scrotum, the left testes hangs lower than the right one to reduce friction.
Section B, female anatomy.
The ovaries are the female gonads. They are the primary female sex organs. Their main job is to produce ova. These female sex cells are also known as eggs. Eggs produce the female sex hormones estrogen and progesterone.
Estrogen is the female sex hormone responsible for female puberty and the maturation of the reproductive system. And progesterone acts with estrogen to develop the breasts and jumpstart menstruation. It also maintains the right environment in the uterus for implantation and growth of a zygote.
Just like males, females also have a duct system. It's made up of three structures: the uterine tubes, the uterus, and the vagina.
The uterine or fallopian tubes cordially receive and conduct the ovum from the ovaries and toward the uterus. They also provide fantastic sites where fertilization takes place.
The uterus is a hollow organ with thick walls. It is the site of implantation of a zygote. Remember, a zygote is formed in the fallopian tubes and housed in the uterus. That means its job is to receive, retain, and nourish a completely fertilized egg. The uterus leads into the vagina through an opening called the cervix.
These layers are the perimetrium, which is the outer layer, the myometrium, which is the thick muscular middle layer, and the endometrium, which is the inner layer. The endometrium is the site where embryos are implanted. Yep, that's where the zygote latches on.
The superior or upper sublayer of the endometrium is called the functional layer. This is the layer that crumbles away during menstruation.
Don't worry, the wall of the endometrium is eventually regenerated and replaced by an underlying sublayer called the basal layer, so it can fall off all over again and again and again.
The third duct is the vagina. The vagina is a thin-walled tube that is the female copulatory organ. The vagina is also a passageway for baby delivery and menstrual flow.
The female external genitalia, or vulva, is made up of the mons pubis, the labia majora, the labia minora, the vestibule, and the clitoris.
The mons pubis is a fatty round area overlying the pubic bone. After puberty, it is covered with pubic hair. The labia majora are pigmented, hair-covered outer fatty skin folds. They are located posterior to or behind the mons pubis. The mons pubis is the female answer to the scrotum.
The labia minora is a thin, delicate, inner fold covered with a thin layer of mucous membrane and oil. They're completely enclosed by the labia majora. The vestibule is an inner region completely enclosed by the labia minora. This area contains the greater and lesser vestibular glands. These glands are kind of like the bulbourethral glands in the male reproductive system. They release mucus into the vestibule in order to lubricate it during sexual intercourse.
The clitoris is the last part of the female external genitalia that we'll talk about. The clitoris is a female erectile organ that's kind of like the penis. It's the main structure that contributes to female arousal.
The clitoris is a protruding structure made up of erectile tissue. It has 2 roots and, like the penis, it also has a shaft.
The clitoris is full of sensory nerve endings, so, like the penis, the clitoris is sensitive to the touch. In fact, if it helps your memorization, you can think of the clitoris as a mini penis. Or if it suits you, the penis could be a jumbo clitoris.
The breasts are also sometimes discussed with the female external genitalia.
Female breasts contain a number of structures that are really important if you want to nourish a newborn baby. These structures are the mammary glands and the nipples. The mammary glands are modified sweat glands contained inside the breasts. They produce the milk that nourishes a newborn baby. The milk is produced by small glands and then carried to the nipples by a system of ducts.
The nipple is the structure that ejects milk. The areola is the center section of the breast that surrounds the nipple. It contains sebaceous glands which produce oil that prevents the nipple from drying up and cracking.
The areola is pigmented and darkens during pregnancy. This dark area is like a marker that helps the infants locate the milk.
We've come to the end of the tape. If you go get a snack and leave your VCR running, the tape will come to its end and your VCR will shut off automatically. Then you can resume watching old Who's the Boss reruns.
We've done a lot. We've explored all the systems: circulatory, respiratory, digestive, urinary, and all the rest.
Now, if you have any questions, feel free to call us at 1-800-VCR-REVIEW. Otherwise, turn off your TV and go pass that test.
But before you do that, why don't you sit back and say goodbye to the friends you've met and the systems you've explored.
Every once in a while, people mess up, and now here are the bloopers.
Life. Pigeons, joggers, dogs, homeless people. Every person's human.
The main structures that make up the kidneys are tiny blood
There are 3 layers. These layers.
Well, you are in for a treat. It's story time.
Ah, the female duct system.
Woo! So sit back and enjoy a classic tale entitled.
I got a head rush.
In females, the gonads are called ovaries. In males, the gonads are called